Commence primary ignition.
I'm just not the hero type, clearly.
What a piece of junk.
Enterprise, this is the captain.
I got a bad feeling about this.
It's all part of the plan.
Engage.
Welcome back to Podcast 2 for 1. I'm your host, Donovan Thompson, with my co-host,
Daniel Wingfield.
And today is episode 141 of Podcast 2 for 1. Yes, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and notification bell. That way you're updated on all future episodes of Podcast 2 for 1, as well as all the cool content we have at 2 for 1 Studios, youtube.com/2 for 1 Studios, the best place to consume the content. And if you didn't know, and boy, oh boy, I bet you didn't, we are sponsored by Kapow Comics, located at 4047 East Kill Avenue in Sherwood, Arkansas. There they have comic books, collectibles, graphic novels, and of course, special guest appearances throughout the year.
Kapow!
Give me a kapow, Garrett. There we go, kapow. And guys, if you didn't notice already, we are joined today by a very special guest, Mr. Garrett Tuggle. Garrett, thank you for being on the podcast today.
Hey guys, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure. It's an honor, as it were.
An honor. Well, we're very honored to have you as well. Again, boys, today's episode 141 of Podcast 2 for 1. And of course, if Garrett Tuggle is on Podcast 2 for 1, that means we're going to be talking about Lord of the Rings, and more specifically, Amazon's Rings of Power. And so this is something we talked a little bit on the pre-show a second ago about Garrett's love of Lord of the Rings and also Daniel's love of Lord of the Rings. But I want to hear from both of them first. I'm like more of an average goer. Of course, I love the original trilogy when it came out. And, those hold a special place in my heart for various reasons. But I don't think I dive into it like you two do. So Garrett, I want to hear from you first before we start breaking down Rings of Power. What does Lord of the Rings mean to you, and like how much of a fanboy are you? Give me the bridge. Give me the short bridge version. We only have an hour here.
Sure. Well, I'll start off by saying I don't go anywhere without the two king swords. There you go.
That's awesome.
Andriel, and then you get
that's freaking awesome.
No, I'll put it this way: I convinced as far as how big a fan I am, I convinced my wife, as Donovan well knows, to have a Lord of the Rings themed wedding, a Hobbit wedding, as it were. And it was fantastic. We had a great time. My wedding ring, as a matter of fact, is the ring is the one ring with the inscription on it. Now, Lord of the Rings started for me. So I was homeschooled, and my mother, who was an English teacher, decided to homeschool the four of us kids. And I had a very difficult time with ADHD. So, I mean, very difficult. I'm always she bought the stack of books like this high, that were all about how to deal with a kid like me. It's just like can't get them to concentrate on anything. Can't get. And she knew from being a teacher prior to having children of her own, becoming and homeschooling us, that someone like me probably would not have thrived in the public school system because my condition was such. She tells a funny story of trying to get me to sit down to read. And, it's like the most basic of basic, books for like a toddler. And I'm here like 5-6 years old, should be reading just fine. And can like barely sound out the things because my mind is all over the place. I'm everywhere but there. She'd get me to, go through a text, and I just kind of pause and ask her, why are buffalo brown? Like, I mean, it was just crazy stuff. It was infuriating for her. But she was wonderful nonetheless. So my connection with Lord of the Rings actually started. My mother brought home a book from a children's book series called The Magic Tree House. And she just went through, just like any young kid, I loved anything with dinosaurs, dragons, knights and stuff. And she went through and like found like book 4 or 5 in the series and just grabbed it because it was a children's book, and on the cover it had like a knight slaying a dragon on it. And she's like, maybe he'll be interested enough in this. Sure. So she puts it in my hands, and sure enough, I began to read some. It's like first grade reading level book, but I read it. The next book series I read was the Lord of the Rings trilogy.
Wow.
After that. So yeah. I think by the time I finished the Lord of the Rings trilogy, I was 9 years old. Because instantly when I jumped in there, it just clicked with me. It was like, here's something I care about. Here's something I enjoy. And here's something that I can invest myself. A symptom of the condition, I guess you could say, that I have is that I get extremely obsessed with things. If I'm not interested in it, you go in one ear and out the other. I have to concentrate very hard on paying attention, which a lot of people deal with that to some extent. However, the flip side of that, if I am interested in it, I will know more about that thing in like 2 weeks than anybody, as if I went got a bachelor's degree in it. So that's kind of where it all started with me with Lord of the Rings. I remember my father bringing home on Valentine's Day VHS copy of The Fellowship of the Ring, and watching that on VHS and just being blown away. Here I was like 9-10 years old when I watched this. And year after year, per Tolkien, I'm sure at least Daniel would agree, Tolkien's kind of the gift that keeps on giving. Like, the more you get into it, the more you learn. And now here I am, almost 30 years old, and I've been obsessed with Tolkien this whole time for 20 years now. And I'm still learning things. Like, I'm reading a book right now, The Nature of Middle Earth, which was, to be fair, was just released about a year or so ago. But I'm like learning things that Tolkien had written on little parchment pieces of paper in his study that never actually got published before. They're just facts about, how they started, how they age, when they get pregnant, how long their pregnancies last, and all this other kind of stuff. So that what Tolkien did with his laying out that world and making it virtually a bottomless pit where you can invest yourself and just keep investing in yourself and reinvesting yourself and always getting something back. I tell people all the time, because it's a joke, I've forgotten more about Tolkien than most people will ever learn, because sure. it's just kind of that way. So that's where my love for Tolkien kind of started. And then it was enhanced by the Lord of the Rings films, because Donovan, as you remember, you and I met in an acting class, and I wanted to, the Lord of the Rings films are actually what inspired me to want to be an acting, or at least try my hand out at acting. And the appendices for the Lord of the Rings extended edition films, I would watch those as much as I watched the actual films. I love the process that Peter Jackson went through, the love and heart that they poured into that. And I love the experience that the actors had on that. And it was my dream, like, one day, I even made a joke when they first announced Rings of Power. Like, I'm going to get to the casting, by the time I'm going to do this thing, by the time they cast for Rings of Power, and I'm going to be and I'm glad that I wasn't, but that's for later. We'll talk about that. So that's where all of my Tolkien section kind of started and has maintained to this day.
That's awesome. Daniel, give me your Lord of the Rings
I kind of had an alternate path there. I actually was introduced by the movies, by the films. That was my first. I think I'd heard of The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. My parents had read them, but I hadn't read them, and I didn't really know anyone that was into them. And then watching Peter Jackson's trilogy, I watched the first one, and I didn't even know it was a trilogy at first. So the Fellowship of the Ring just ended, and I was like, that's a really weird way to end an adventure story. No, I fell in love with the films, and then from the films found the books. And I think I've read the main trilogy, The Lord of the Rings, Two Towers, and Return of the King, I think 3 times in high school, just because I would finish it and be like, I want to read something else good, and I couldn't find anything else that I felt was as interesting or good as just reading them again. And on it is so dense that it's easy to an extent. Like, there's always parts of it where your just brain kind of stops being able to process everything that Tolkien's throwing at you, because it's just like encyclopedic, in its detail and extent. But I fell in love with them then, and I think the movies to those books, or the connection that those books have with those movies, I think is really strong. Obviously, they're not word for word an adaptation, and you can't take something in one medium and like for like remake it in a separate medium, and it's always going to be different just because you're changing format. And so there's differences, but I think those Peter Jackson movies, I think they're to me like some of the best adaptations I've ever seen as far as capturing the heart of what Tolkien wrote about and how he wrote and what his stories were about, I think. And I think, even just in terms of storytelling and being a filmmaker and storyteller, I think the epicness and the grandeur of those movies I got very enticed and romanticized by that. And I think, you know, making a trilogy like Lord of the Rings, something that is epic and badass and also sweet and personal and has like really poignant themes and messages, like that's kind of like some ideal filmmaking for me. Like I want to make stuff like that, you know what I mean, that hits those same notes, even if it's not a high fantasy something that is that level of nuance, that level of interesting characters, and just that level of heart. I think those movies just have just a ton of heart to them. That's me.
Well, that was the impressive thing about the Lord of the Rings, especially, and I think it took everybody by surprise. As many of us know, it's the first of its type to win the type of awards that it did, the trilogy. Mm-hmm. But the fact that it had all those things you're talking about, the nuance and the heart and the storytelling ability, and it was a fantasy film. No one had ever seen that before. You know, the closest thing we had gotten to a beloved fantasy, you know, epic was like Willow or something, in terms of, and so it was kind of written off before it started. But
there's something to say about the third movie in the franchise being nominated the most for Academy Awards out of the franchise. That's kind of that's unheard of, and it's still unheard of. Actually, I don't know a franchise that has been able to achieve that actually, but. I'm okay. Again, if everyone's listening, clearly there's no two better people to have on this podcast than Daniel Wingfield and Garrett Tuggle from Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. So, guys, I'm sure Garrett probably knew before we did, but Amazon bought the rights years ago, at least part of the rights, right? They got the movie rights and then parts of the Silmarillion or the appendices in Lord of the Rings. I'm sure you'll correct me on this, Garrett. So
they don't have the Silmarillion.
Okay, so they got partial rights, right? They don't have everything.
They did lead everyone to believe that they had acquired the rights to the entire Tolkien estate.
Okay.
Which is why it was such a huge deal when it first happened.
Right.
And obviously, if you looked at the price tag that they paid for it, everyone just assumed that's what had happened because nothing like a deal like that had never been made in the history of television or even cinema. So
it's huge. And obviously this production had some of the most scrutinous eyes available from the internet and just people at large, fans, not fans. I mean, when they start announcing things like the first season of television costs $500 million, and then actually it and season 2 will cost $1 billion because they're building sets that will be used for season 2. I could be wrong on the numbers there, but roughly, basically, these are giant level blockbuster movie size budgets, but broken down into 8 episodes or more for a television show. Now, obviously, we know Amazon and Jeff Bezos, they got that money to throw around, and I guess delivering your package on time isn't good enough for them, and they want to get into more, which I get it. So I remember we have a thread. Travis has been on the show a couple of times, Travis Moser, but me, Travis, and Daniel, as soon as these Rings of Power trailers started dropping, we were watching them feverishly and scrutinizing them and talking about them and everything else. On our end, it was probably more positive. I feel like on a filmmaking level, I feel like the budget was being used that they were touting. Like, okay, look, if you had that kind of budget, it needs to show up. And I feel like in this case, it did, for the most part. But on the other side of that, we had, again, I'm not someone who's just super tied to this universe. If it was Marvel or something else, I'd be like picking with a fine tooth comb. But on the other flip side of that, there's tons of negative reactions on YouTube. Like the most disliked video or one of the most disliked videos on YouTube, we have Reddit, we have videos popping up on, all these different sites about how they're ruining these characters, how they're taking Tolkien's lore and warping it and manipulating it. I can say on my end, base level, I want from both of you guys your 30-second to 1 minute reason why you don't like this show or why you do like this show. And then after that, we'll kind of break further into some of these ideas. But on my end, ultimately, I felt like, again, I'm not a super fan, but I enjoyed it. I thought it did enough for me in the time period that it's in to, be entertaining. I thought the production value was great. Thought the acting was good for the most part. I for me, it has a classical kind of cinema thing, which I miss. I like backlighting on people. I like interesting staging and stuff like that. I thought the action was good. And for me, even though they, through this, I started kind of investigating some of the Tolkien. I've always been interested in like some of the lore, but I was kind of like, I always felt like there was a lot of gatekeeping and it just kind of hard for me to get into. But this kind of allowed me to kind of, okay, go investigate some more and like, what are the differences and what did Tolkien actually say? And I had the ability, in my opinion, to like, okay, here's what the show's doing, but here's what Tolkien actually did too. And it's its own thing, right? And, I can have both. So I kind of walked down on it positive for season 2. I think it's slow in some parts. I think it's, some characters I don't always love, but overall I enjoyed it overall. So Garrett, what do you think about Rings of Power?
Well, I tell people oftentimes I'm cursed with the knowledge that I have about Tolkien. Like, I'm cursed not being able to come to this like you were able to,
Sure.
not knowing what's supposed to happen.
Right.
My own opinion is that this show should not have been made, primarily because it is focused on a period of Tolkien's lore, which we're talking about Tolkien here. We're not just talking about any fantasy world builder that, we're talking about a guy who spent the better part of like 50 plus years developing a world in extreme detail for a specific reason. Everything had a reason, essentially. So we're not talking about a nonchalant scenario here. When you're making a show or a series, especially if it's going to be 5 seasons, approximately 50 hours or what have you, about a period, and it's supposed to be an adaptation of works that you don't even have the rights to, that's where it should just stop. Because in my opinion, that's where it's hard to justify it as anything other than a cash grab.
Sure.
Because if you're really setting out to make a true adaptation, which we all understand, like was mentioned previously, the Peter Jackson films had changes, but they were done in such a way that really respected the spirit of Tolkien. But if that's your setup out of the gate, and which I wholeheartedly believe is why they misled everyone and led everyone to believe they did have the rights, because the instant response would have been like, well, then no way, don't even do it. Like,
Sure.
just don't do something like Star Wars is doing now with like Tales of the Jedi, where you can tell like small stories that are, largely disconnected or what have you. If you want to do something like that, okay. But you cannot tell an epic about the Second Age in particular, which by all means is even more epic than the Third Age, if we do see it in the Lord of the Rings in terms of just events, without owning the rights to any of the books that are actually about the Second Age. So all they really have is the appendices of the Lord of the Rings to go off of. And if you're going to try to structure $1 billion show with approximately 50 hours of content off of a few pages of the appendices, you can't help but literally make up 90+% of the stuff, which is exactly what they've done. So for me, it's just nothing more than fan fiction. And I think personally, from a film junkie and a television junkie's point of view, I don't think it was very good television in terms of if they changed all the names and it wasn't even Tolkien, I don't think it'd be a particularly compelling show. And that's just my take on it, my hot take.
Yeah, that's hot. I brought the right people on here.
Yeah, I think for me, I'm a little less extreme on the I think I have to like look at the show as like kind of from 2 perspectives. From one of this, like as a creator, as someone that maybe hopes something I make someday, maybe one day will be adapted into something cool. That'd be cool. There's this side of me that I see exactly what you're saying, Garrett. I think you're right. I think it was a strategically wrong decision to try to adapt things that you literally don't have the rights to adapt what's actually canon. Like, because it wasn't so much they had to make things up because it's like they weren't allowed to use anything that shows up at all in the Silmarillion, which is what tells everything that happens in this story. So I think you're right. As soon as they said we don't have Silmarillion, they should have said, okay, then we need to make a post Third Age movie or series. Like, fine, go to the future.
Unfinished tales. I mean, I'll show you guys this. What you currently propping up my, the histories of Middle Earth. That's like a 12-volume collection of stuff that happened. All about events of the Second Age and everything else. They didn't have anything. They only had the rights to rights that have already been sold, which we've gotten Lord of the Rings out of. They had the rights.
Yes. And I think it's
not to interrupt. Question real quick, and Garrett may know this. Is there I would just assume speculation, like those other rights for those, like the books you just showed us, and for Silmarillion, maybe those are just even more expensive. I mean, like I don't
think the estate wants to sell them. I think wasn't that the thing that the estate refuses to sell them? They don't like the Jackson films either. And
the Tolkien estate in particular, Christopher Tolkien had issues with the Peter Jackson films, and that was expected. So essentially what has happened is that the Tolkien estate, the only rights that are up for sale are the rights that Tolkien himself had already sold in the past. So before Tolkien's death, he actually sold film rights to both The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. Now, The Hobbit was suppressed after it was sold briefly, and then basically the rights were suppressed for a very long time. Which is why Peter Jackson didn't actually make the Hobbit series first, Hobbit film first. He intended to, but they could not acquire the rights for it. So he made Lord of the Rings. But yeah, that's the reason that no one has been able to access the rights, which is one of the reasons why everyone freaked out when it was originally announced that Amazon and Netflix were in a bidding war for the rights. And it was for the whole Tolkien estate is what it was kind of reported as. And then when the price tag came through, everyone just assumed that's what had happened because it was a ridiculous amount of money. So, that's the situation. It's really only the rights that Tolkien himself had already sold in the past.
Okay.
So like I said, I think I totally agree with what you're saying, Garrett, in terms of like creatively, I think it was a mistake to go in this direction with the rights that they had and what they could talk about, what they could say. But okay, so that's in the end they did. So we are where we are. This is the show they made. So you're right. I kind of also look at it like fan fiction, which is the same way I look at pretty much all the new Star Wars stuff because George isn't touching it either, right? But I think then, to be fair, there's some really good fan fiction out there. Okay, so let's look at it. So I think my brain says like, okay, so is this good fan fiction? And I think it's okay. I think it's not great. I think that it is so much banking on the nostalgia and previous knowledge of the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings films. It feels like they're constantly trying to make these really emotional, like revealing moments that are tying back to that, which is a mistake. You immediately alienate all super fans because we know this isn't canon. So it doesn't matter that you're tying back to something that you don't, that doesn't really exist in this reality. At least you're pretending it does, but it doesn't, you know what I mean? And so it's like this, it becomes this complicated thing of like, it's almost like House of Dragon when they were referencing season 8. It's like, don't do that. Like you don't want people to think about something like that. It's like this, it's like, guys, why are you referencing something that is like, it can only be better than what you are because it is canon in a way. Like you're referencing something that you're only going to pale against every time you do it. Right?
Another part of that is just it was another reminder to Tolkien fans. And I hesitate to say real Tolkien fans because that gives connotations that you can't be a real Tolkien fan without being a Tolkien nerd, and that's not the case. But the serious Tolkien fans, every time they made in Rings of Power, every time they allude to the Peter Jackson films, it's just one more reminder that they're not alluding to the actual works of Tolkien. They're riding the coattails of the success of the Peter Jackson films, and everything that they've done is to try to emulate that success. But it's such a poor imitation because the heart of the reason the Peter Jackson films are good is because Peter Jackson gave an interview very early on where he talked about, hey, we have our own politics, we have our own perception of the world. This is a very tumultuous time during the world. If y'all remember, this is 9/11 and all this other kind of stuff is happening. And he said, but we had to make a decision very early on that we were not going to be interested in putting our junk in. We're not going to be interested in putting our point of views. How do we look at what Tolkien wrote and insert the messages and the beliefs that Tolkien held dear? And because they made that kind of effort, what we got was the masterpiece that was the Peter Jackson films. But it's like when you copy a JPEG again and again and again, and the quality is just like slowly, the file size just keeps going down. So what we're getting is like, it's almost as if they said, okay, we don't have the rights to the books. We are going to try to make money on this thing somehow. How do we dress this thing up? How do we know what was successful Peter Jackson films? So how do we constantly push people?
Yes.
Like you said, ride the coattails of nostalgia off Peter Jackson films to make this a success. And it just doesn't work. It falls flat every time. There's even repeated lines. There's even lines that they have some characters say, phrases that I'm able to change the wording up slightly for the Rings of Power that are almost word for word for a line or a phrase that's said in the Lord of the Rings. That just when you hear it, you're like, I know what they're doing. Like, I know, but it just doesn't have the impact that it would, that it does when, Han Solo says something, in Force Awakens that you knew was, a callback to what. That's an actual nostalgia. What this is doing is like, it feels very cheap. It feels like they can't make it on their own steam, and so they're using the Peter Jackson films to prop themselves up.
I agree. I think there's a lot of times, like there's that. Okay, so one of my favorite moments in the Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring, is the scene when the Fellowship exits Moria right after Gandalf has fallen, and it goes slow motion, and it has this beautiful, like operatic, almost like singer.
Oh my goodness!
This show wanted to have that moment twice an episode. But the amount of times we were in slow motion for emotional moments was every time there was an emotional moment. It was like, let's go down to crazy low frame rate. And like, it looks great. But when you do it twice an episode, it's not impactful. That was one of the few times in the Fellowship when we get that. There's a couple other moments of like that slow down that slow, but they're very rare. And like, so when they hit really hard and they feel really good. But when you're doing it all the time, I was just like, every time, like I like after like the third episode, I was like, I'm noticing the pattern. And then I was just like waiting for like, oh, there it is. I knew it was coming. Like there's usually a first half of the episode, slow down, music swells moment. And there's a second half of the episode. And to me, like, it's kind of like that's, it's a little bit just like cheap entertainment, right? Like, it's like it's almost like the other side of like sex sells, because like if you just put nude like attractive people, like our eyes can't help but want to look there. Like if you swell music and you slow everything down and have these really pretty shots into characters' eyes and the lighting's just perfect, you can also just emulate like feelings of like, oh, this feels powerful or it feels important. But I agree with you that it lacks the it feels shallow. It feels like an imitation.
It completely arc that the Lord of the Rings had, the Lord of the Rings trilogy had. And I would even argue that the Hobbit trilogy had. We haven't even talked about it, but I would argue that the Hobbit trilogy had plenty of its own issues. It's like Peter Jackson did the George Lucas thing with the original and the Star Wars prequel, but
well, it wasn't his fault, to be fair on that. That was studio's problems.
Yeah, Peter Jackson had a hard take on that. And for all that it's got wrong, The Hobbit has some moments when they nail it in The Hobbit. When it is Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, they nail it. They absolutely nail it. One of my favorite scenes in the whole saga is in An Unexpected Journey when they find the troll lair, and Gandalf gives Bilbo Sting, which Sting and Gandalf's sword and Orcrist's Thorin's sword are all kind of cousin swords from Gondolin. And he gives Bilbo Sting, and Bilbo basically says, I don't know that I could, actually have courage for this. And Gandalf says, true courage is not knowing about when to take a life, but when to spare one. And that is called back to when they tie that in when Bilbo actually spares Gollum's life when he's escaping Gollum's cave. And it was the music and everything that we were just talking about is just so spot on, and it was so like original Lord of the Rings trilogy. It just felt amazing. It felt so Tolkien too. This was absent of all that. The closest thing they try to get to it, there's that really weird moment. I forget what episode it is, maybe episode 3, where Elendil and Galadriel are talking, and Elendil's like, "Oh yeah, there's a place where we have a temple here on the seashore," and Galadriel's like, "Oh, let's go." and they ride their horses there, and there's like this really strange, like 7-second long slow motion scene of Galadriel riding this horse with like this really goofy expression. And I'm not throwing jabs at the woman's looks or anything like that, but it was just like they drew that out, and it was just kind of those things where you're like sitting and you're watching, like a couple seconds in, you kind of shift around because you're just uncomfortable. You're just
bored. You just get this show. I feel like easily lost my attention most of the time. Like it was like there was whole storylines where I was just like, I don't care.
I can agree with that.
The Harfoots, I just like I think like parts of it are cute, and the actors. I think the casting in this show is fantastic. Actually, I think the casting has been really good. The actors all look, I think, good, and like the costumes look fantastic. But it's also just like boring a little bit too when we switch to one, and I'm like, all right, I don't care anymore. I guess I'll get on my phone. Like, and it's not even like I'm trying to. It's just like I instinctively like I noticed myself checking out and watching it when we switch to certain characters or we switch to certain arcs. That just because, like, I mean, especially by the end, like I really only cared about the final reveal about Sauron, which I think I'd accidentally gotten a little spoiled by, so I knew who it was, but like I was that whole plot line and that them finding out who Sauron was and how that was going to go down. I was interested in that, and I was interested in a little bit with the like who knows who he's going to be, but the Atari guy at the like his moment.
Adar. The
you think
Adar
that's
character.
Adar? Yeah, I mean I've seen lots of people. Well, and then they threw that line at the end where he says the line that Gandalf says later. So that it feels like they're intentionally either like messing with us or something. Yeah. But
it feels like it's either Gandalf or it's Saruman. That's what I feel like.
I think it's gonna a lot of the red like. The problem is we don't know what they're doing. Are they just?
They're trying to make him all 5 wizards at once, and it just doesn't.
I think they will make him Gandalf because of what you said earlier, Garrett, which is that they're only reusing this show to ride the success of the Peter Jackson trilogy. And to the super fans, it would be really cool if they introduced a brand like the TLOTR, I think was maybe the name of like the first Atari that's sent. I'm probably
so the Eastery are actually there were 2 blue wizards that are sent, and Tolkien actually wrote this, and then he retconned himself on this and said later that it was actually so none of the wizards are actually supposed to show up until the Third Age. So they're several thousand years early right now at this point in the show. However, Tolkien did at one point, which they don't have the rights to this writing anyway, so it still wouldn't make sense. But Tolkien did at one point suggest the blue wizards actually showed up at the end of towards the end of the Second Age, and that Saruman, Radagast, and Gandalf, who at the time was called Aloran, show up at the beginning of the Third Age. However, they're doing the best they can to not tell. I honestly would not be surprised if they don't even know who this wizard is yet. Just based on the way this show has been written, it's been written so vaguely for the actual characters. It's almost as if I don't think it's a coincidence that the next season is not supposed to come out for 2 years, because they had no idea how this was going to go. As a matter of fact, there's reports right now that J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay have now been sidelined, most likely, especially depending on how the award season goes, from being the showrunners. So they're going to be swapping out a bunch of other stuff.
Amazon's been real quiet about viewer numbers, and like
they've hidden a lot of them. I mean,
this is the most expensive show of all time. I mean, I know that this is like Jeff Bezos' like personal baby, right? Like he considers himself a super fan, and like. And is like, it seems like maybe Jeff would be willing to lose money on this. You know what I mean? Like he's that much of a personal fan. But at some point, if this isn't getting the numbers that it needs to, like you can't justify spending $1 billion on season 2 if like you got half of the viewers you thought you were going to get.
Yeah, the way Jeff Bezos tells it is that his son is actually the larger fan, which is a convenient way to say. I bear no responsibility. If this is good, I did it for my son. If it sucks, it's because I don't actually know I'm doing it. His son came up to him and said, "Dad, you better not, screw this up effectively." And so this is how he made. But that was, Jeff Bezos made those comments at the very beginning of the kind of production of this thing of actual production, physical production. And you really haven't heard anything from him since. He never said prior to the release of it, like, this is going to blow y'all's socks off or anything like this. He never made he's never made an announcement. I honestly think Jeff Bezos has forgotten about this. I think this is another product of Amazon, and they're trying to get Prime viewership, because let's be honest, Prime doesn't. If not for the fact that Prime saves you a boatload in shipping costs, most people would not be Prime viewers based on their streaming service. Not that there's not good
stuff. It is the worst streaming service. It's the worst interface of all the streaming services. Period.
Right.
Mainly because they mainly show you content that isn't Prime content, and you think it is, but they just oh no, but here's another list, but actually this is stuff you have to buy, and they don't tell you when they switch.
This looks horrible, man.
The amount of hidden tricks and deception and misguided social media posts, articles. Amazon owns everything. They own IMDb, for instance. The amount of that stuff that has gone on prior to the release of this show, and especially since the release of this show, delaying ratings for over a week and a half, where they wouldn't let anyone go on and review the show because they said it was reviewed bomb. Somehow only the 1 and 2 stars got removed, but all the 4 and 5 stars got allowed to stay. And you could read some of those 5-star reviews, and you're like, a robot wrote this. Like, this is not a real person. Like, this is, it's just stuff like that is just kind of, and like I said, I think it was Chris Gore that reported that there's actually talks at Amazon Studios right now about a complete reboot if they continue the series. So JD Payne, I call it JD and P, they are effectively probably sidelined. I mean, that from everyone, all the reliable sources are basically saying those guys are out. It was not, because with this kind of money, this could not just be a Supernatural that was allowed to run for 12 seasons, longer than it should have or whatever. This couldn't just be even Breaking Bad. This had to be Game of Thrones ×2 in terms of its like scale, its crowd interest and everything. Yeah, because that's the only way you could justify the budget that it had. And you're talking about a streaming service anyway that doesn't have a box office weekend. Streaming services don't.
I mean, I don't know. I think that even if you got 2 more showrunners, I'm not quite sure that it would have been much better. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know.
No,
I don't know. Yeah, I think with what material they had, and like, I guess where they tried to adapt, I think they probably hit almost as good as they could hit.
Well, and I think you're actually right, Donovan, and I think that proves the point that we said earlier, was that this was a bad decision from the beginning, because you're right, Garrett. This needed to be Game of Thrones level hit.
Yeah.
For them to keep justifying that budget, to greenlight a similar budget for next season. It needed to, and at the same time, it had to literally compete with a Game of Thrones IP, which is funny.
Which was good. Can we talk about how
I enjoyed it. Yeah, I enjoyed it.
It was incredible.
Not be good, and it blew my far exceeded
exactly. I was very skeptical, and it was really good. But I think
not to interrupt you, my wife is not a Tolkien nerd. She appreciates it. She loves it. I love it. All of that. Again, she liked it enough, or loves me enough to let us have a Lord of the Rings. But when we watched Lord of the Rings with my stepdaughter last year, and my wife was so into it. My stepdaughter enjoyed it. We watched The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. As a matter of fact, she's like, "This is just so good." Yes, it is. Let's watch it every 3 months. All right. We were watching Rings of Power. She sat down with me to watch it. And like 10, 15 minutes in, she was like on her phone. I'm like, "Babe, are you not going to, she's like, "It's just not catching my, I'll give it a shot." That was every episode for her. As someone who doesn't know anything about Tolkien, doesn't know, not the super nerd that I am, could not hold her interest. And if you can't hold the interest of someone who appreciates fantasy and likes Game of Thrones, and she's excited every night that it was time to watch Game of Thrones. You can't hold the interest of someone like that for the budget that you have. It's due. There's no way you can sustain that.
Like literally, this feels like an executive. This felt like a analytics decision, right? They said, look, here's how many numbers we can point to for fans of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which will translate into this percentage of new fans for this, and like. It feels like this show came out of that numbers decision of like, we think we can get this return on this if we just and honestly, this is not an Amazon issue. This is a problem I'm seeing occur in Marvel and occur in Star Wars as well. But it's like they are it's almost like they're taking nostalgia and they're just trying to turn it into a numbers game of like, well, we know that these people watch if we just have Obi-Wan say hello there, and have like these certain moments that we need in the Obi-Wan Kenobi show to appease this demographic, and it just feels like everything is turning into a numbers decision like first, and like the creative vision, not that it's not like someone's coming in like, I have an idea so good that we can't not make it. That's not happening right now very much in the industry, in these big IPs, and we are seeing, I think, across the board, Star Wars, Marvel, and this, that it's not working. You can't just connect to fans by shoveling them like pre-baked nostalgia on things that were popular 10, 15, 20 years ago, and just expect them to be like, it's fine. They gave me what I always said I wanted on those Reddit message boards. They gave me that scene or that moment or that line. And it's like, yeah, but you gave it to me in like the least effort way as possible. And I think this
conversation with Donovan in the recent past, that I said something like this. I think we were just messaging back and forth or something. And I actually had a conversation with another guy this guy is a decent Tolkien fan, and he actually liked Rings of Power. And he made the comment, I'm just so glad to be back in Middle Earth again. I said, stop it right there. That's the problem. They knew you were going to say that.
You're right.
They knew that we cannot be the kind, if we want the Luke Skywalkers, and we want the epic, if we want the hours upon hours spent pretending to lightsaber fight in our backyard, or killing orcs, or being Hulk, or whatever, that doesn't come from cheap nostalgia tricks or cheap storytelling that is just trying to cash in on people's childhoods.
Yes,
that comes from original stories that have heart, that just so happen to be in these universes. That's the stuff that hits. I said, as long as we say, hey, as long as there's lightsabers in there, I'll show up and give them my money. As long as you say that, they will keep shoveling us absolute crap for Star Wars. Well, and as long as you keep saying, I'm just so glad to be back on Earth. I don't care if it's lore accurate. I don't care if it's true to the characters. I don't care if it's the way Tolkien wrote it. I don't even care if it makes sense within the universe that it's built on. As long as it has the Tolkien title on it, or the rings or whatever, I'm going to show up and give them my money, and I'm just happy to be back in Middle Earth again. It'd be like someone making a Hulk movie and him having suddenly being attributed all the powers of Spider-Man. They don't explain it.
Yes, right.
But
no, you're right.
Hulk movie.
Now I understand, Garrett. The whole time I've been twiddling my thumbs. What's his problem? But now I get no. I do want to say. I do want to say one thing. No, I know. I do want to say one thing, and some of you guys listen to you guys talk. It brings up this issue that Daniel kind of touched upon a second that I've been having all year long. We've been having all year long on the podcast, and probably the last 3 years. We talked. Our last pod, me and Daniel's, was on House of the Dragon, and we both had pretty glowing reviews for it, especially considering we both unanimously hated the end of Game of Thrones, the OG Game of Thrones. So, like from that to where we are now is a kind of an achievement for that TV show. But there's these automatic comparisons, right, between House of the Dragon and Rings of Power, and it even was amplified, as Daniel said. They were playing at the same time, right? And I think what's interesting here too is that I think House of the Dragon, which is this darker kind of more, it's a fantasy that we could probably imagine it took place a couple hundred years ago on our end, but it has dragons in it. Lord of the Rings is much different, right? It's mystical. It's a fairy tale. This feels like a fairy tale. Yeah, and I also wonder if maybe Lord of the Rings is not that. Maybe a long form format is not the best kind of thing to digest. Something like a family friendly kind of fantasy versus House of the Dragon, where if it can be done right, yeah. But I'm saying, like, would have Rings of Power been better as a 3-hour movie versus an 8-hour thing?
Maybe, okay, so maybe the fan fiction might have kept my attention longer if they cut out the fluff and only had
I'm
the
not even
stuff.
saying like I guess I'm saying more like does that kind of fairy tale work better in a 3-hour movie versus an 8-hour thing?
I don't think that affects it. I think
for the to be made today by Peter Jackson, it would be a limited series. I think it would be a
Probably so, actually. Yeah, that's that. I like that.
30-hour thing. You have to remember the time the Lord of the Rings was made. Literally the only thing close in time frame like what we have to modern television now is The Sopranos, and that was the only thing that had ever come out that was even close to resembling the accepted television format that we have now, which is linear storytelling, where the plot doesn't essentially reboot every episode.
Because there's so much they could have included in a limited series that they never got to include in the books and the movies, and would have made it work. You could have had Tom Bombadil and made it work. You know what I mean?
Sure. Yeah. I get what you're saying, but I'm not trying to argue a point either way, but I wonder though if Peter Jackson had made the Fellowship of the Ring into an 8-episode season, would it be as revered as it is today? You know
I think yes, if he was doing it, because it's not about it's about the intention that he sat down with to make those movies, which was to get what Tolkien meant and was talking about. And it wasn't just him, right? It was Ian McKellen and I'm blanking on the other actor's name that was Saruman, that were like Tolkien experts and correcting him on set when the dialogue didn't match what was in the book. You know what I mean? Like, so this was
to truly adapt a book they took, as long as it would not basically be a death sentence for the cinema version. So there are things that happen in books, as we all know, that just can't translate to film. We know that. It just doesn't work.
There's too many songs. They can't have as many songs and poems in
the reason I know for a fact that it would work is because the movies are 3 hours long each theatrically. Once you get out the extended editions, it adds an extra 35 minutes to the Fellowship of the Ring, and adds an extra 45 minutes to the Two Towers, and it adds an extra 50 minutes to the Return of the King. So, but cumulatively between those, you're actually adding another 2.5 hours to the entire story of the original Lord of the Rings trilogy, and we still can't get enough of it. Like, fans are still like, really, because there's still footage that Peter Jackson has held back that never made the extended cut, that fans are like petitioning for when he does these like 4K remasters to like, please release a 25th anniversary edition with like the other 3 hours of footage that you shot that never made it in, because we can't get enough of the storytelling, because the storytelling is more of Tolkien. And that's the thing.
Here's the thing with Lord of the Rings and Peter Jackson. Peter Jackson was the god of that production, and Peter Jackson was creative. He said the most important thing here is that we stay true to the source material, right?
The spirit.
For one, with Rings of Power, they don't have source material to stay true to. But to me, the other thing that like, to me is a telltale sign of like, you're just throwing money at things you don't really understand. It's because it's like, all of that budget that went into Rings of Power went into the cinematography. I mean, some of those shots are just gorgeous. The size of the sets, the amount of extras, the amount of just like horses on screen or whatever it was is incredibly impressive and looks aesthetically good, but it's all empty. Yeah. Because it doesn't have someone like Peter Jackson in charge saying, doesn't matter. It goes back to that thing of like, Lord of the Rings will forever. It's getting more and more dated by the year, right? Every year the CGI looks a little less good, or like the sets, you're starting to see the cracks a little bit more that before you never could tell. But with all of that included and all the polish and sign that Rings of Power is a mockery of what Peter Jackson did because of that creative vision. And I think that's like, when you look at Disney, you look at Star Wars, you look at Amazon, creators don't have the final say. Producers that are aware of budgets and aware of returns have final say. I mean, if you look at the behind the scenes of those Peter Jackson movies, multiple times he was thinking, I think they're probably going to shut us down. It's too expensive, or we're spending too much money. These movies will never make their money back. You know, like he is despairing because they're always a shoestring away from everything.
The Fellowship of the Ring was considered the most expensive independent film ever made, because until it released at the great success, that's basically what it was. Like, they had patched together finance to get that first film.
And it works because of that creative person in charge. I think that is something that the industry as we are losing this, like we don't have any more like director led industry really, right? Like that's kind of gone away, and now it's more producer led. The Kevin Feige's are the names you hear, not Steven. I mean, you still hear there's not a new Steven Spielberg, right? There's a Kevin Feige, and that feels like what we got instead. And I think
and a lot of it, a lot of it has to do as well with the unfortunately politics plays a role in everything. Obviously, in today's world, politics is going to come in, and we are crippled right now. And this can serve a purpose, and then at the same time, it can bankrupt things creatively. You have things like diversity quotas, which sound nice on the surface, but when you literally have, before the writer even begins, basically a bullet point that says X number of lines must be given to this character of this representation and of this gender or whatever it is, this skin color, and X number of main lead characters have to be this orientation or this skin color or this. Well, now you're imagine taking a creative mind and saying, write me a story, but first let me give you all these parameters you have to write the story inside of. The creative juices don't flow there. You end up in a situation which we're seeing with all of our shows now, where it's about checking boxes. It's like, you have a certain amount of time before you have to see a character that represents a certain demographic pop up. Not that they shouldn't be included in that, or that character does or says anything that is just off the wall. But it's like the fact that you're expecting creative minds to bend to those kinds of things is just, you might as well just crush all creativity right there, because now they're having to fulfill quotas and then simultaneously write their story instead of just writing good stories. And there was obviously a lot of backlash when the Rings of Power was announced and the casting was announced, because it was such a diverse cast. I have my own thoughts on all that. Personally, Tolkien went to such depths to make sure that his world made sense. He wrote the Lord of the Rings. Tolkien always mourned the fact that England did not have its own mythology. So all the mythological writings that told England had were basically destroyed in the Norman invasion. And so England literally lost its mythology. So all these other countries have their mythologies. The closest thing England had was like King Arthur, which is really more of a French tale anyway. So Tolkien mourned that fact. He wanted to make an Anglo-Saxon European history mythology for England. And so that's the way he wrote it. And that's the way he wrote all of his characters. And that's, Tolkien famously wrote a letter one time when this is during the world, not long after World War II. And they asked, it was a German writer that wanted to know, or a German publisher that wanted to know if Tolkien had any Jewish ancestry before they agreed to publish his works. And Tolkien basically replied back, I regret to inform you that I have no ancestors of that great people. I mean, he just stuck it to him. Or what? Tolkien didn't have a bigoted bone in his body. However, he knew what he wanted, and he wrote that. And so some of the backlash for this show was justified. And I think for me, as well as others, before the thing even came out and we saw, those were just the red flags. Not because, oh my gosh, they're trying to put people of color in our Tolkien. That was not the issue. It was, where are the liberties going to stop? So if they're going to be this flippant with the way Tolkien set up this world, what else are they going to change? And I'm sad to say that they went about as far off book or off track as they could. So I'll just go ahead and list things that, just make absolutely no sense. For instance, the elves just don't seem like elves. I don't know how y'all feel about it. The elves just don't. They're not ethereal beings in this Rings of Power. They're just people with pointy ears, really. In this, and they talk about being around for thousands of years, but they don't have any actions that back that up. Elrond, I think, is probably the best actor out of the character. And I can't remember his name. I know he's young. He's young Stark, Ned Stark in Game of Thrones. Remember that. But he and Durin's storyline during the fourth are probably the only two characters that actually engaged me in the show, where I did
like Durin a lot.
Yeah, I enjoyed watching their story.
I like that too.
Like, as full of like gross, lore destroying things as it was. I enjoyed watching their story play out just from that's how I know I have a perspective that is just from a enjoying good television perspective that worked. But why would you make your protagonist the most obnoxious character ever put on television screen. Like, Galadriel is supposed to be smart, beautiful, wise, all these things. Okay, yeah. She's smart, except for every decision she makes in the Rings of Power thus far is the wrong decision. She's rude to literally everyone, and somehow still convinces people to follow her and like go along with her crazy plans, which makes no sense. The Numenorians, for instance, they're supposed to be virtually the Spartans of Middle Earth at this point in time. Numenorians have conquered everything, and you do not get that from this show. They are like, most of the soldiers are like boys. They're like teenage boys, and the city is just very, very passive. I think the most Numenorians we see on the screen at any point in time is like 100 riders, maybe. They're supposed to literally rule everything, rule the seas, rule the shores. They are the bosses. We don't get that epic grand scale with them. We don't get none of the characters like King Gilgalad or Gilgalad, depending on where you want to put, if you want to put a hyphen in there or not. The dude's basically the antagonist of the series until the last 20 minutes when they decided to do their Sauron reveal. And Gilgalad was like the most noble of elven kings. I mean, this dude is good as gold. He's an absolute hero of the Second Age, and they almost vilify him. Just decisions like that were so, for anyone who is aware of the actual characters, it's impossible to like enjoy it, because everything is just like, well, that didn't happen. That didn't happen. That didn't happen. I would say probably my favorite part of the entire series was the prologue. I thought from a visual standpoint, that was beautiful. I mean, watching a fell beast and an Nazgul go at it, or in a great eagle go at it, in the battlefield in the War of Wrath, that was incredible to see things like that. On a whole, though, it's like every chance they had to miss the mark, they did. Even storytelling things that they did not have to. We talk about them not having the rights. They didn't have to go off base on some of these things, and they just choose to. Like, for instance, Sauron, Halbrand's character. What a terrible. Terrible reveal. The last 20 minutes so there's a show called The Rings of Power, and you go 8-hour-long episodes, and you don't even show any rings until the last 20 minutes of the last episode. You forge them quicker than you can even like keep up with what's going on. And Halbrand comes along. He's supposed to be, I won't even get into all the lore things. He's supposed to be Anatar, Lord of Gifts, and he's supposed to be a gift from the Maiard and from the Valinor, all this other kind of stuff. But Sauron is not supposed to even know that those rings are really made at all. And yet, so Sauron's here. He helps them make those, kind of helps them make the rings. Galadriel's there for it. She learns that he's Sauron, and then her next like decision is to be like, well, those rings that the Sauron was helping us make, 5 minutes ago. Why don't we go ahead and do that? Like, why don't we just go ahead and go with that? I just learned that like the guys whose idea it was Sauron. Why don't I just go? Just things like that make no sense even within the context of the show. Sure. It's just laziness on every front, and it's just, and it couldn't be that. It could not when it's Tolkien. It can't be that. I understand with comic books sometimes, because comic books, it's like how many different Spider-Mans are there? There's we go all the way back to the 60s, and every time there's a reboot of the comics or whatever. So when you make a film Spider-Man, the way kind of I see it, people are like, oh, it's not true to the comics. I'm like, dude, which comic? Because they're taking pieces. Just think of it as its own new comic line, right? But you can't do those kinds of things with Tolkien. And the reason that the Lord of the Rings has the fan base that it has, the reason Tolkien has the loyalty that he has, is the consistency, the world building. There's no insulting of the intelligence of the reader. There's none of that winking that like just kind of overlook this. No. It's taken very seriously, and that's what we need from all of our fan, endeavors. I mean, that's what we need from Star Wars, and that's what we need from Marvel, and that because at one point in time, it was the most serious thing in the world to us. At one point in time, there wasn't anything more serious than Obi-Wan and Anakin duking it out on Mustafar, or Frodo. Dude,
I'm fixing to buy a ticket and go kick Jeff Bezos' ass. Like you're wrong. No. So
hey, you're right. You're right.
We could. Honestly, I mean, I got it when we started the episode, and I'm asking some questions because I want to hear your guys' opinions, and I want to kind of get into that.
I have the red book of West March right here.
Yeah, I totally see everything you guys are saying, and I agree with you. And I think you guys are correct on all fronts. I will two more things, and I unfortunately have to get off here. One, Garrett, will you be watching season 2 of Rings of Power?
Well, I hate watch season 2. I don't know. I'll be honest. I wanted Rings of Power to be good. At this point, I hope it gets canceled, and mainly for it's not like I want. It's mainly because it's like I want the lesson to be taught that if you're gonna do a thing, do it right. At least try. At least try. And I think we. How much money you bought? You spent $400 or something, Donovan, on it.
Whoa, let's not say that on the pod. That's
edited out.
Kimberly doesn't watch this anyway. We're good. We're never mind. We're good. We're good. Never mind. We're good.
I remember if that was before the pod or after we went live.
Yeah. 400 pennies, baby.
$4 on a comic book.
Yeah,
nerds, we drive these industries. We do. Right. It's our money, it's our attention, and it's our fanboying or fangirling that drives this stuff. We've got to stop just accepting all the crap they're shoveling at us just because it bears the name of an IP that we at one point in time adored. And I honestly do believe that this Rings of Power show is the line in the sand that has been drawn, because it's like you can screw around with Star Wars a little bit. You can screw around with some of these other things. You cannot screw around with Tolkien. And I think that's where the line has been drawn. That's just the feeling I get from the wavelengths of all the nerds around the ether out there.
No, I'm curious how it happened. My last question here is: we reported this earlier on this year on 241 Joe Live that the Embracer Group, which is like a film, media, and gaming company, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is earlier, that they have acquired some of the rights to Lord of the Rings. And they have reported that in a press release, opportunities include exploring additional movies based on iconic characters such as Gandalf, Aragorn, Gollum, Galadriel, Eowyn, and other characters from the literary works of J.R.R. Tolkien, and continue to provide new opportunities for fans to explore this fictive world through merchandising and other experiences. So it sounds like, whether we like it or not, at the moment, we're getting more Lord of the Rings in some way. Yeah. Is this a bad idea or a good idea? And again, we only have a couple minutes, so let's keep this one short. I want to hear from both of you guys. Daniel, let's go with you first.
Yeah. Bud.
Do we need more Lord of the Rings?
It's probably a bad idea, because I think you're right, Garrett. I think Hollywood is in this mode and I think it's very clear when you look at Star Wars and Marvel that they're like, you don't have to do it well, you just have to do it. Just do it. Doesn't matter if it's how far you think it. Just give the fans what they want. You know what I mean? And what I thought of when they said, a Gandalf movie, I thought of the Obi-Wan series, and I thought, if it's even a little better than the Obi-Wan series, don't even do it. You know what I mean? Like, if that's the level that they're going to bring it to, which is the standard right now when it comes to IPs in Hollywood, like when they're working on existing IPs. Maybe I think part of it is because of streaming and because everyone's trying to get content for streaming. Part of it is because everyone's looking for the next MCU, because the MCU is the most profitable thing in the world. But everyone is just trying to make as much content as possible, as quickly as possible, and then they're just cutting corners. And so, I think it's probably a bad idea. I hope, honestly, I think the only way it could potentially be good is if maybe, you're right, Garrett, if maybe Rings of Power cancels because it just did so poorly, and so they say, hey,
let's think twice.
Work. Because I think I think there is a level with Tolkien fans, because there's a single source of canon. There's a different level of fanaticism about canon that I see from Tolkien fans than I see from almost anything else.
It's the kind of world building that comes with that, and that's what you see. That's the diehard J.R.R. Martin fans, the diehard Wheel of Time folks. It's the world building. It's the effort that was put in. The fun thing about arguing about Star Wars is not arguing whether or not, the big picture stuff. It's arguing whether or not, how far is the Kessel Run? How quick is a parsec? It's the nerdy stuff, the deep stuff. That's what you want to invest in. That's what people care about. And so, do I think it's a good idea? Listen, I want more. Okay. I'll put this on your radar. There's a Lord of the Rings animated film being made by Warner Brothers right now called Lord of the Rings: The War.
Keep in mind, boys, we got about 30 seconds. We're going to get off here. But go on.
War of the Rohirrim. I am excited about. It's an animated film. It's going to have Miranda Otto come back as Eowyn. I'm excited about that. It's being headed up by a lot of the Lord of the Rings folks, the Lord of the Rings trilogy folks. So all new content. Am I against it? No. Being done respectfully and very carefully. That's what I want to see.
Perfect. Daniel, how can listeners write into us?
Listeners, you can write into bit.ly/2for1mail. Let us know what you thought of Rings of Power. Surely we have some other Tolkienites out there. Are you in line with Garrett? Did you feel like it was an affront against the name of Tolkien? Which I'm closer to that than Donovan, or more like Donovan, who just kind of was able to enjoy it for what it was. Let us know, bit.ly/2for1mail.
And if you can't hit us up in our bit, you can always reach us in the comment section below. Again, youtube.com/2for1studios, the best place to consume the content. Again, episode 141. I believe in a couple of weeks, we're hitting our 3-year anniversary, and we'll have Dr. Bruce Hutchinson back relatively soon to, I believe, discuss Avengers Endgame and what's sure to be a long-ass breakdown episode. That's a long-ass movie, so we're going to talk a long-ass time about it. Garrett, I can't thank you enough. And again, just clearly everyone, hopefully in the first 5 minutes, understood that you and Daniel on here that are the premier people to talk to and to listen to about Lord of the Rings. And I can't thank you enough. Is there any way our listeners can find you on social media or on YouTube, anything like that you'd like to plug?
Yeah, so I do have a YouTube channel. It's just called Chisholm Tuggle, CHISM Tuggle, TUGGLE. I'm not as avid a content producer as Donovan and Daniel are, but I do like to put fan service stuff out there from time to time. I have a few Star Wars videos and Lord of the Rings videos and such out there on there, but mainly follow 241 Studios and stay tuned to what these guys do.
I appreciate it. And Garrett, if you didn't know, we always sign off with famous words our Mandalorian friend Din Djarin imparted on us when we started 3 years ago, and that's how we end every episode. So thank you all for watching. My name is Donovan Thompson.
My name is Daniel Wingfield.
I'm Garrett Tuggle.
And we have spoken.